Disc 5.
Once we were alone together on the bus, my mother said, "Tell me, what's bothering you?" When I didn't reply, she began to explain Alvin's behavior at the train station. Alvin is ashamed. He feels ashamed for us to be seeing him in a wheelchair. When he left, he was strong and independent. Now, he wants to hide, and he wants to scream, and he wants to lash out, and it's terrible for him. And it's terrible, too, for a boy like you to have to see your big cousin like this. But that's all going to change just as soon as he understands that there's nothing about the way he looks or about what happened for him to be ashamed of. He's going to gain back the weight he lost, and he'll start to walk everywhere on his artificial leg, and he's going to look just as you remember him before he left for Canada. Does that help any? Does what I'm telling you reassure you at all? I don't need to be reassured, I said. But what I wanted to ask was, his stump, what does it mean that it's broken down? Do I have to look at it? Will I ever have to touch it? Are they going to fix it? On a Saturday a couple of weeks earlier, I had gone into the cellar with my mother and helped her empty the cartons full of Alvin's belongings, rescued by my father from the Wright Street room after Alvin had run off to join the Canadian Army. Everything washable, my mother scrubbed on the washboard in the divided cellar tub, soaping in one sink, rinsing in the other, and then feeding a piece at a time into the wringer, while I cranked the handle to force out the rinse water. I hated that wringer. Each piece of wash emerged flattened out from between its two rollers, looking as if it had been run over by a truck. And whenever I was down in the cellar for whatever reason, I was always afraid to turn my back on the thing. But now, I steeled myself to drop each wet, deformed item of mangled laundry into the laundry basket and carry the basket upstairs so that my mother could dry everything on the backyard clothesline. I fed her the clothespins as she leaned from the window to hang out the wash, and while she stood in the kitchen after dinner that evening ironing the shirts and pajamas that I had just helped her to reel in, I sat at the kitchen table folding Alvin's underwear and rolling each pair of socks into a ball, determined to make everything turn out right by being the best little boy imaginable. Much, much better than Sandy, and better even than myself. After school the next day, it required 2 trips for me to carry Alvin's good clothes around the corner to the tailor shop where they did our dry cleaning. Later in the week, I picked them up and at home placed everything, top coat, suit, sport jacket, and 2 pairs of his pants, on wooden hangers in the half I'd apportioned him of my bedroom closet, and stacked the rest of the clean apparel in the top 2 drawers that had formerly been Sandy's. Since Alvin was going to be sleeping in our bedroom, to provide him with the easiest possible access to the bathroom, Sandy had already gotten himself ready to move to the sun parlor at the front of the flat by arranging his own belongings in the break front in the dining room, beside the linen tablecloth and napkins. One evening, a few days before Alvin's scheduled return, I shined his pair of brown shoes and his pair of black shoes, ignoring as best I could any uncertainty I had as to whether shining all 4 of them was still necessary, to make those shoes gleam, to get his good clothes clean, to neatly pile the dresser drawers with his freshly washed things, and all of it simply a prayer, an improvised prayer imploring the household gods to protect our humble 5 rooms and all they contain from the vengeful fury of the missing leg. I tried to gauge from what I saw beyond the bus window how much time remained before we got to Summit Avenue, and it was too late to unseal my fate. We were on Clinton Avenue, just passing the Riviera Hotel where, as I never failed to remember, my mother and father had spent their wedding night. We were clear of downtown, about halfway home, and directly ahead was Temple B'nai Abraham, the great oval fortress built to serve the city's Jewish rich, and no less foreign to me than if it had been the Vatican. "I could move into your bed," my mother said, "if that's what's bothering you. For now, until everybody gets used to everybody else again, I could sleep in your bed next to Alvin's bed, and you could go in and sleep with Daddy in our bed. Would that be better?" I said that I'd rather sleep alone in my own bed. "What if Sandy moved back from the sun parlor to his bed," my mother suggested, "and Alvin slept in yours, and you slept where Sandy was going to sleep, on the day bed in the sun parlor?" Would you be lonely up at the front of the house, or is that what you would really prefer? Would I prefer it? I'd have loved it. But how possibly could Sandy, who is now working for Lindbergh, share a room with someone who had lost his leg going to war against Lindbergh's Nazi friends? We were turning onto Clinton Place from the Clinton Avenue stop, the familiar residential corner where, back before Sandy deserted me for Aunt Evelyn on Saturday afternoons, he and I used to disembark for the double feature at the Roosevelt Theater, whose black-lettered marquee was a block away. Soon, the bus would be sailing past the narrow alleyways and the 2.5 family houses lining the level length of Clinton Place, streets that look much like our own, but whose red brick bank of gabled front stoops aroused not a one of the basic boyhood emotions that ours did, before arriving at the big final turn onto Chancellor Avenue. There, the grinding pull up the hill would begin, past the elegant fluted piers of the spiffy new high school, onto the sturdy flagpole out front of my grade school, and through to the crest of the hill, where a band of Lenny Lenapes were said, by our third-grade teacher, to have lived in a tiny village, cooking their food over hot stones and drawing designs on their pots. This was our destination, the Summit Avenue stop. Diagonally across from the platters of freshly dipped chocolates, profligately displayed in the lace-trimmed windows of Anna Mae's, the sweet shop that had succeeded the Indians' teepees, and whose tantalizing scent honeyed the air less than a 2-minute walk from our house. In other words, the time left to say yes to the Sun Parlor was precisely measurable and running out. Movie theater by movie theater, candy store by candy store, stoop by stoop, and yet all I could say was, no, I'll be fine where I am, until my mother had nothing soothing left to suggest, and, despite herself, went gloomily silent in a very ominous, undisguised way, as though the eventfulness of the morning was at last working her over the way it had me. Meanwhile, since I didn't know how long I could go on concealing that I couldn't bear Alvin because of his missing limb and his empty trouser leg and his awful smell and his wheelchair and his crutches and the way he wouldn't look up at any of us when he talked, I began to pretend that I was following somebody on our bus who didn't look Jewish. It was then that I realized, employing all the criteria imparted to me by Earl, that my mother looked Jewish. Her hair, her nose, her eyes. My mother looked unmistakably Jewish. But then, so must I, who so strongly resembled her. I hadn't known. What made Alvin smell bad was all the decay in his mouth. You lose your teeth when you got problems, Dr. Lieberfarb explained, after looking around with his little mirror and saying, 19 times. And that very afternoon, he started drilling. He was going to do all the work for nothing because Alvin had volunteered to fight the fascists, and because, unlike the rich Jews, who astonished my father by imagining themselves secure in Lindbergh's America, Lieberfarb remained undiluted about what the many Hitlers of this world might yet have in store for us. 19 gold inlays was a big deal, but that's how he showed solidarity with my father, my mother, me, and the Democrats, as opposed to Uncle Monty, Aunt Evelyn, Sandy, and all the Republicans currently enjoying their countrymen's love. 19 inlays also took a long time, particularly for a dentist who trained in night school while working days packing cargo crates at Port Newark, and whose touch was never that light. Lieberfarb was drilling away for months, but within the first few weeks enough of the rot had been removed so that it was no longer such a trial to be sleeping more or less next to Alvin's mouth. The stump was something else. Broken down means that the end of the stump goes bad. It opens up, it cracks, it gets infected. There are boils, sores, edema, and you can't walk on it with the prosthesis and so have to be without it, and resort to crutches until it heals and can take the pressure without breaking down again. At fault was the fit of the artificial leg. The doctors would tell him, "You've lost your fit." But he hadn't lost his fit. He never had a fit, Alvin said, because the leg maker hadn't got the measurements right to begin with. "How long does it take to heal?" I asked him the night he finally told me what broken down meant. Sandy, up at the front of the house, and my parents in their bedroom had already been asleep for hours, and so too were Alvin and I when he began to shout, "Dance! Dance!" and with a frightening gasp shot upright in his bed, wide awake. When I flipped on the night lamp and saw him covered with sweat, I got up and opened the bedroom door, and though suddenly covered in sweat myself, I tiptoed across the little back foyer, not to my parents' room, however, to report what had happened, but into the bathroom to get Alvin a towel. He used it to mop his face and his neck, then pulled off his pajama shirt to wipe his chest and his underarms. And now at last, I saw what had become of the upper man since the lower man had been blown apart. No wounds, stitches, or disfiguring scars, but no strength either. Just the pale skin of a sickly boy adhering to the knobs and ridges of bone. This was our 4th night together. On the first 3 nights, Alvin had been careful to change into his pajamas in the bathroom, and then to hop back to hang his clothes in the closet, and since he used the bathroom again to dress in the mornings, I hadn't as yet had to look at the stump, and could pretend I didn't know it was there. At night, I turned to the wall and, fatigued by all my worries, fell right off to sleep, and remained asleep until sometime in the early hours, when Alvin got up and hopped to the bathroom and back to bed. He did all this without turning on the light, and I lay there afraid he was going to bang into something and crash to the floor. At night, his every move made me want to run away, and not merely from the stump. It was on this 4th night, when Alvin had finished drying himself off with a towel and was lying there in just his pajama bottoms, that he pulled up the pajama's left leg to take a look at the stump. I suppose this was a hopeful sign, that he was starting to be less crazily agitated, at least with me. But I still didn't want to look his way. And so I did, trying to be a soldier in my bed. What I saw extending down from his knee joint was something 5 or 6 inches long that resembled the elongated head of a featureless animal, something on which Sandy, with just a few well-placed strokes, could have crayoned eyes and nose, a mouth, teeth, and ears, and turned it into the likeness of a rat. What I saw was what the word stump describes, the blunt remnant of something whole that belonged there and once had been there. If you didn't know what a leg looked like, this one might have seemed normal to you, given how the hairless skin was rounded off softly at the abbreviated end, as though it were nature's handiwork and not the result of a trying sequence of medical amputations. "Is it healed?" I asked him. "Not yet." "How long will it take?" "Forever," he replied. I was stunned. Then this is endless, I thought. "Extremely frustrating," Alvin said. "You get on the leg they make for you, and the stump breaks down. You get on crutches, and it starts to swell up. The stump goes bad, whatever you do. Get my bandages from the dresser." I did as he told me. I was going to have to handle the beige, elasticized wrappings he used to prevent his stump from swelling when the artificial leg was off. They were coiled up in a corner of the drawer beside his socks. Each was about 3 inches wide and had a large safety pin stuck through the end to keep it from unrolling. I no more wanted to plunge my hand into that drawer than to go down to the cellar and stick it into the wringer, but I did. And when I delivered the bandages to the bed, one in each fist, he said, "Good boy," and was able to make me laugh by petting my head like a dog's. Afraid to see what came next, I sat on my bed and watched. "You put this bandage on," he explained, "to keep it from blowing up." He held the stump in one hand, and with the other, undid the safety pin and began to unroll one of the bandages in a crisscrossing pattern over the stump and on up to the knee joint, and then several inches beyond that. "You put this bandage on to keep it from blowing up." He repeated the words wearily with exaggerated patience. "But you don't want bandages over the breakdown, because that won't let the breakdown heal. So you're just going back and forth until you're nuts." When he finished unrolling the bandage and inserted the safety pin to fasten the end, he showed me the results. "You have to pull it tight, you see?" He began a similar routine with the second bandage. The stump, when he was through with it, again reminded me of a small animal, this time one whose head had to be muzzled extra carefully to prevent it from sinking its razor-sharp teeth into the hand of its captor. "How'd you learn that?" I asked him. "You don't have to learn. You just put it on. Except," he suddenly announced, "it's too goddamn tight. Maybe you do have to learn. Goddamn son of a bitch. It's either too fucking loose or too fucking tight. It makes you nuts, the whole goddamn thing." He removed the safety pin that fastened the second bandage and then undid both bandages in order to start again. "You can see," he told me, struggling now to suppress disgust with the futility of everything, "how good at doing this you get." And resumed the rewrapping which, like the healing, appeared destined to go on in our bedroom forever. The next day, when school was over, I ran straight home to a house that I knew would be empty. Alvin was at the dentist, Sandy was off somewhere with Aunt Evelyn, the two of them inexplicably helping Lindbergh achieve his ends, and my parents wouldn't be back from work until supper time. As Alvin had settled on using the daytime hours to allow the breakdown to heal unbandaged, and the nights to wrap the stump to prevent the swelling, I readily found the two bandages in the corner of the top dresser drawer where he returned them rolled up that morning. I sat on the edge of my bed, turned up my left trouser leg, and shocked to realize that what remained of Alvin's leg was not much bigger around than my own, set out to bandage myself. I'd spent the day at school mentally running through what I'd watched him do the night before, but at 3:20 when I got home, I'd only just started to wrap the first bandage around an imaginary stump of my own when, against the flesh below my knee, I felt what turned out to be a ragged scab from the ulcerated underside of Alvin's stump. The scab must have come loose during the night. Alvin had either ignored it or failed to notice it, and now it was stuck to me, and I was out way beyond what I could deal with. Though the heaves began in the bedroom, by racing for the back door and then down the back stairway to the cellar, I managed to position my head over the double sink seconds before the real puking began. To find myself alone in the dank cavern of the cellar was an ordeal under any circumstances, and not only because of the wringer, with its smudged frieze of mold and mildew running along the cracking, whitewashed walls, stains in every hue of the excremental rainbow and seepage blotches that looked as if they'd leaked from a corpse. The cellar was a ghoulish realm apart, extending beneath the whole of the house, and deriving no light at all from the half-dozen slits of grime-clouded glass that looked onto the cement of the alleyways and the weedy front yard. There were several saucer-sized drains sunk into the bottom of a sloping concavity at the middle of the concrete floor. Secured in the mouth of each was a heavy black disc pierced by the concentric dime-sized perforations from which, with no difficulty, I imagined vaporous creatures spiraling malevolently up from the earth's innards into my life. The cellar was a place bereft not just of a sunny window, but of every human assurance. And when I came to study Greek and Roman mythology in a freshman high school class, and read in the textbook about Hades, Cerberus, and the river Styx, it was always our cellar that I was reminded of. One 30-watt bulb hung over the washtub into which I'd vomited. A second hung in the vicinity of the coal furnaces, ablaze and bulkily aligned together like the three-person Pluto of our underworld, and another, almost always burned out, was suspended from an electrical cord inside each of the storage bins. I could never accept that the wintertime responsibility would fall to me for shoveling coal into our family's furnace first thing each morning, then banking the fire before going to bed, and once a day carrying a pailful of cold ashes out to the ash can in the backyard. Sandy had by now grown strong enough to take over from my father, and in a few more years, when he went off like every other 18-year-old American boy to receive his 24 months of military training in President Lindbergh's new citizen army, I would inherit the job and relinquish it only when I, too, was conscripted. Imagining a future when I'd be in this cellar manning the furnace all alone was, at 9, as upsetting as thinking about the inevitability of dying, which had also begun tormenting me in bed every night. But I mainly feared the cellar because of those who were already dead, my two grandfathers, my mother's mother, and the aunt and uncle who once constituted Alvin's family. Their bodies may have been interred just off Route 1 on the Newark Elizabeth line, but in order to patrol our affairs and scrutinize our conduct, their ghost resided 2 stories beneath our flat. I had little or no recollection of any of them, other than of the grandmother who died when I was 6, and yet, whenever I was headed for the cellar by myself, I took care to warn each in turn that I was on my way and to beg them to keep their distance and not to besiege me once I was in their midst. When Sandy was my age, he used to arm himself against his brand of fear by barreling down the cellar stairs shouting, "Bad guys, I know you're down there. I've got a gun." While I would descend whispering, "I'm sorry for whatever I did that was wrong." There was the ringer, the drains, the dead, the ghosts of the dead watching and judging and condemning as I vomited into the double sink where my mother and I had washed Alvin's clothes. And there were the alley cats who would disappear into the cellar when the outside back door was left ajar, and then yowl from wherever in the dark they were crouched. And there was the agonized cough of our downstairs neighbor, Mr. Wishnow, a cough that sounded from the cellar as though he were being ripped apart by the teeth of a 2-man saw. Like my father, Mr. Wishnow was an insurance agent with the Metropolitan, but for over a year he had been on disability pay, too ill with cancer of the mouth and the throat to do anything but stay at home and listen to the daytime radio serials when he wasn't asleep or uncontrollably coughing. With the blessing of the Home Office, his wife had taken over for him, the first female insurance agent in the history of the Newark district, and now kept the same long hours as my father, who generally had to go back out after dinner to make his collections, and canvassed for prospective customers most every Saturday or Sunday, weekends being the only time when he could hope to find a breadwinner at home to listen to his spiel. Before my mother had herself begun to work as a sales lady at Haynes, she would stop downstairs a couple of times a day to see how Mr. Wishnow was doing. And now, when Mrs. Wishnow called to say she couldn't be home in time to cook a proper dinner, my mother would prepare a little more of whatever we were eating, and Sandy and I, before we were allowed to sit down to our own meal, each carried a warm plateful of food to the first floor on a tray, one for Mr. Wishnow and one for Selden, the Wishnow's only child. Selden would open the door for us, and we would maneuver our trays through the foyer and into the kitchen, absorbed in trying not to spill anything as we set them on the table where Mr. Wishnow was already waiting. A paper napkin tucked into the top of his pajamas, but looking in no way able to feed himself, however desperately in need of nutrition. "You boys all right?" he would ask us in the shredded rag of a voice that was left to him. "How about a joke for me, Philly? I could use a good joke," he allowed, but without bitterness, without sadness, merely demonstrating the soft, defensive joviality of someone still hanging on for no seeming reason. Selden must have told his father that I could make the kids laugh at school. And so I would teasingly be asked to tell him a joke when just by his proximity he'd have obliterated my capacity to speak. The best I could do was to try to look at somebody whom I knew to be dying, and worse, resigned to dying, without allowing my eyes to see in his the gruesome evidence of the bodily misery he was being made to pass through on the way to a spectral life in our cellar with all the other dead. Sometimes, when Mr. Wishnow's supply of medicine had to be refilled at the drugstore, Selden would hurry up the stairs to ask if I wanted to go with him, and because I had learned from my parents that Selden's father was doomed, and because Selden himself acted as if he knew nothing about it, there was no way I could think of to refuse him, even though I'd never liked being with anyone so nakedly eager to be befriended. Selden was a child transparently under the sway of his loneliness, undeservedly rich with sorrow and working much too hard to achieve the permanent smile. One of those skinny, pallid, gentle-faced boys who embarrass everyone by throwing a ball like a girl, but also the smartest kid in our class and the school-wide whiz at arithmetic. Oddly, there was nobody in gym class better than Selden at scrambling up and down the ropes that dangled from the gymnasium's high ceiling. His aerial nimbleness, integrally related, according to one of our teachers, to his unchallengeable adroitness with numbers. He was already a little champ at chess, which his father had taught him, and so whenever I accompanied him to the drugstore, I knew there was no way to prevent my winding up later at the chessboard in his family's darkened living room, dark to save electricity, and dark because the drapes were now drawn all the time, to keep the neighborhood's morbidly curious from peering in at Selden's step-by-step descent into fatherlessness. Undeterred by my stern resistance, solitary Selden, as he'd been nicknamed by Earl Axman, whose mother's overnight mental collapse had been a startling parental catastrophe of another order, would try to teach me for the millionth time how to move the pieces and play the game while behind the back bedroom door, his father coughed so frequently and with so much force that there seemed to be not one father but 4, 5, 6 fathers in there coughing themselves to death. In less than a week it was I, and not Alvin, who was bandaging his stump, and by then I'd practiced enough on myself, and without again throwing up, that he hadn't once to complain of the bandage being too loose or too tight. I did this nightly, even after the stump had healed and he was walking regularly on the artificial leg, to stave off a resurgence of the swelling. All the while the stump was healing, the artificial leg had been at the back of the clothes closet, largely hidden from sight by the shoes on the floor and by the trousers hanging down from the crossrod. It still took some doing not to notice it, but I was determined and didn't know what it was made of till the day Alvin took it out to put it on. Except for its eerily replicating the shape of the lower half of a real lower limb, everything about it was horrible, but horrible and a wonder both. Beginning with what Alvin called his harness, the dark leather thigh corset that laced up the front and extended from just below the buttock to the top of the kneecap, and that was attached to the prosthesis by hinged steel joints on either side of the knee. The stump, with a long white woolen sock pulled over it, fit snugly into a cushioned socket carved into the top of the prosthesis, which was fashioned of hollowed-out wood with air holes punched into it and not, as I'd been imagining, of a length of black rubber resembling a comic book bludgeon. At the end of the leg was an artificial foot that flexed only a few degrees and was cushioned with a sponge sole. It screwed neatly into the leg without any of the hardware showing, and though it looked more like a wooden shoe tree than a living foot with 5 separate toes, when Alvin slipped into his socks and shoes, the socks washed by my mother, the shoes shined by me, you'd have thought that the feet were both his own. The first day back on his artificial leg, Alvin exercised in the alleyway by walking back and forth from the garage at the far end to the scrawny hedge enclosing the tiny front yard, but never a step further, to where he could be seen by someone out on the street. The second day, he again exercised alone in the morning, but when I got home from school, he took me outdoors with him for another session. This time, not just concentrating on his walking, but pretending that the soundness of his stump and the fit of his prosthesis and the long future ahead as a one-legged man weren't weighing on his mind. The following week, Alvin was wearing the leg around the house all day, and the week after that he said to me, "Go get the football." Only we didn't own a football. Owning a football was as big a deal as owning cleats or shoulder pads, and no kid had one who wasn't rich. And I couldn't just go and sign one out from the playground back of the school unless we were going to use it right there. So what I did, I, who'd not stolen anything so far, other than some change from my parents' pockets, what I did without a moment's hesitation was to stroll down Keir Avenue to where there were one-family houses with front and back lawns and case every driveway until I saw what I was after. A football to steal. A real leather Wilson football, scuffed from the pavement with one leather lacing and a bladder you inflated, that some kid with money had left unattended. I tucked it under my arm and took off, tearing all the way up the hill to Summit Avenue, as if I were returning a kickoff for old Notre Dame. That afternoon, we practiced pass plays in the alleyway for close to an hour, and at night, when we examined the stump together behind our bedroom's closed door, we saw not one sign of its breaking down, even though while tossing me his perfect left-handed spirals, Alvin had been taking practically the whole of his weight on the artificial limb. I didn't have a choice, is the defense I would have formulated had I been caught in the act on Keir Avenue that day. My cousin Alvin wanted a football, Your Honor. He lost his leg fighting Hitler, and now he's home, and he wanted a football. What else could I possibly do? By then, a month had passed since the awful homecoming at Penn Station, and though it wasn't necessarily pleasant, I'd feel no revulsion to speak of when, while going for my shoes in the morning, I reached to the back of the closet for Alvin's prosthesis and handed it across to where he was seated on the bed in his undershorts, waiting his turn in the bathroom. The grimness was fading, and he'd begun gaining weight, gorging himself between meals on fistfuls of whatever was in the refrigerator, and his eyes didn't look so enormous, and his hair had grown thick again, wavy hair, so black it had a waxen sheen, and so, as he sat there semi-helpless with his stump exposed, there was more each morning for a boy who worshipped him to worship. And what there was to pity was a little less impossible to bear. Soon, Alvin was no longer confining himself to the alleyway, and without having to rely on the crutches or the cane that had humiliated him to use in public, he was all over the place on his artificial leg, shopping for my mother at the butcher's, the bakery, and the vegetable store, buying a hot dog for himself down at the corner, taking the bus not only to the dentist on Clinton Avenue, but all the way on to Market Street to buy a new shirt at Larky's, and also, as I didn't yet know, dropping by the playing fields back of the high school with a separation pay in his pocket to see who might be hanging around wanting to play poker or shoot craps. After school one day, the two of us made room in the storage bin for the wheelchair, and that night after dinner, I reported to my mother something that had dawned on me at school. Wherever I was, and no matter what I was supposed to be doing, I found myself thinking about Alvin and how I could get him to forget about his prosthesis. And so I said to my mother, if only Alvin had a zipper on the side of his pant leg, it would be easier for him, wouldn't it, to get in and out of his pants when he's got his leg on. The next morning, on her way to work, my mother dropped off a pair of Alvin's army trousers with a neighborhood seamstress who worked out of her house, and the seamstress was able to open the side seam and sew in a zipper that extended some 6 inches up the uncuffed left pant leg. That night, when Alvin pulled on the trousers after having undone the zipper, the pant leg passed easily up over the prosthesis, without his having to curse everyone on earth just because he was getting dressed. And when he closed the zipper, you couldn't see it. You don't even know it's there, I cried. In the morning, we put all his other trousers in a paper bag for my mother to take to the seamstress to fix. I couldn't live without you, Alvin said to me when we went to bed that night. I couldn't put my pants on without you. And he gave me, to keep forever, the Canadian medal that he'd been awarded for performance under exceptional circumstances. It was a circular silver medal, on one side King George VI in profile, and on the other a triumphant lion standing on the body of a dragon. I, of course, cherished it and began to wear it regularly, but with the narrow green ribbon from which it hung pinned to my undershirt, so no one would see it and question my loyalty to the United States. I left it in my drawer at home only on days I had gym and we had to strip off our outer shirts to exercise. And where did this leave Sandy? Because he was himself so busy, he seemed at first not to notice my breakneck transformation into personal valet to a decorated Canadian war hero who'd now gone ahead and decorated me. And when he did, and was made miserable at first, not so much because of Alvin's involvement with me, which was bound to follow from our new sleeping arrangement, but because of the hostile indifference Alvin evinced toward him. It was too late to oust me from the great supporting role, with its nauseating duties, that I'd virtually been forced to undertake, and that, to Sandy's surprise, had elicited such sublime recognition in the waning years of my long career as his little brother. And all of this had been achieved without my once alluding to Sandy's affiliation, by way of Aunt Evelyn and Rabbi Bengelsdorf, with our present hateful administration. Everyone, including my brother, had avoided speaking of the OAA and Just Folks anywhere near Alvin, convinced that until he came to understand how the enormous popularity of Lindbergh's isolationist policies had begun to win even the support of many Jews, and how it was far less traitorous than it might appear for a Jewish boy Sandy's age to have been drawn to the adventure that Just Folks offered. There'd be nothing to mitigate the outrage of the most self-sacrificing and staunchest Lindbergh hater of us all. But Alvin seemed already to have sensed that Sandy had let him down and, being Alvin, didn't bother disguising his feelings. I'd said nothing. My parents had said nothing. Certainly Sandy hadn't said anything to incriminate himself in Alvin's eyes. And yet, Alvin had come to know, or to behave as though he knew, that the first one to welcome him home at the train station had also been first to sign on with the fascists. Nobody was sure what Alvin was going to do next. There would be problems finding a job because not everyone was going to hire somebody who was considered a cripple, a traitor, or both. However, it was essential, my parents said, to thwart any inclination Alvin might have to do nothing and just sulk and feel sorry for himself for the rest of his life while squeaking by on his pension. My mother wanted him to use his monthly disability check to put himself through college. She had asked around and been told that if he spent a year at Newark Academy, earning B's for the courses he got D's and F's in at Weequahic, more than likely he'd be able to get into the University of Newark the following year. But my father couldn't imagine Alvin voluntarily going back to the 12th grade, even at a downtown private school. At 22, and after all he'd been through, he needed as quickly as possible to get a job with a future. And for this, my father proposed Alvin's contacting Billy Steinheim. Billy was the son who'd befriended Alvin back when he was Abe's driver, and if Billy was willing to make the case to his father for giving Alvin a second chance, maybe they would agree to find a place for him in the firm. A lowly job for now, but one in which he could redeem himself in Abe Steinheim's eyes. If need be, and only if need be, Alvin could get a start with Uncle Monty, who'd already come around to offer his nephew work at the produce market. That had been back in those bad early days when Alvin's stump was seriously broken down, and he was still in bed most of the time and wouldn't allow the shades to be raised in our room out of his dread of catching so much as a glimpse of the little world in which he'd once been whole. Driving home from Penn Station in the car with my father and Sandy, he'd shut his eyes once the high school came into view, rather than be reminded of the innumerable times he'd come bounding out of that building at the end of the day, unimpeded by bodily torment and equipped to pursue whatever he wanted. It was on the very afternoon before Uncle Monty's visit that I was a little late returning from school. It had been my turn to stay to clean the blackboards, and got home to discover that Alvin was gone. I couldn't find him in his bed or in the bathroom or anywhere else in the flat, and so I ran outside to look for him in the backyard and then, bewildered, raced back into the house where, from the foot of the stairwell, I heard faint moaning sounds rising from below. Ghosts, the suffering ghosts of Alvin's mother and father. When I edged down the cellar stairs to see if they could be seen there as well as heard, what I saw instead, up by the front wall of the cellar, was Alvin himself peering out of the horizontal little glass slit that looked at street level onto Summit Avenue. He was in his bathrobe, a hand to help him maintain his balance clutching the narrow sill. The other hand I couldn't see. He was using it for something that I was too young to know anything about. Through a little circle of window that had been cleared of grime, he was watching the high school girls who lived on Keir Avenue walk home from Weequahic along our street. Their legs, scooting by the front hedge, was about all that he could have possibly seen. But seeing that much was enough, and caused him to moan with what I took to be anguish at his no longer himself having two legs to walk on. I retreated silently up the stairs and out the back door, and squatted in the farthest corner of our garage, plotting to run away to New York to live with Earl Axman. Only because it was getting dark and I had homework to do, did I return to the house, stopping first to peek into the cellar to see if Alvin was still there. He wasn't, and so I dared to descend the stairs, dashing quickly past the ringer and around the drains, and once at the window and up on my toes, intending only to look out at the street the way he did, I discovered the whitewashed wall beneath the window slick and syrupy with an abundance of goo. Since I didn't know what masturbation was, I of course didn't know what ejaculate was. I thought it was pus. I thought it was phlegm. I didn't know what to think, except that it was something terrible, in the presence of a species of discharge as yet mysterious to me. I imagined it was something that festered in a man's body and then came spurting from his mouth when he was completely consumed by grief. The afternoon Uncle Monty stopped by to see Alvin. He was on his way downtown to Miller Street, where, since he was 14 years old, he'd been working all night long at the market, arriving at around 5 and getting home only at 9 the next morning to eat his big meal and go to sleep for the day. That was the life lived by the richest member of our family. His 2 children fared better. Linda and Annette, who were a little older than Sandy and exhibited the painful shyness of girls who tiptoe around a tyrannical father, had lots of clothes and attended suburban Columbia High School in Maplewood, where there were more Jewish kids who had lots of clothes and whose fathers, like Monty, each owned a caddy for themselves and had a second car in the garage for the convenience of the wife and the grown children. Living with them all in the big Maplewood house was my grandmother, who also had a lot of clothes, all bought for her by her most successful son, and none of which she wore other than on the high holidays and when Monty made her get dressed up to go out to eat with the family on Sundays. The restaurants weren't sufficiently kosher to meet her standards, so all she ever ordered was the a la carte prisoner's meal of bread and water, and then she never knew how to act in a restaurant anyway. Once, when she saw a busboy carrying a staggering load of dishes back to the kitchen, she'd gotten up to go over and help him. Uncle Monty cried, "Ma, no, let him through." Let the boy be. And when she slapped his hand away, had to be pulled back to the table by the sleeve of her ridiculously sequined dress. There was a black woman, known as the Girl, who came by bus from Newark to clean 2 days a week. But that didn't stop Grandma from going down on her knees when no one was around to scrub the kitchen and bathroom floors, or from doing her own wash on a washboard, despite the presence in Monty's finished basement of a brand-new $99 Bendix Home laundry. My Aunt Tilly, Monty's wife, was endlessly complaining because her husband slept all day and was never home at night, though everyone else in the family considered that, far more than her own new Oldsmobile, to be her good luck. Alvin was lying in bed and still in pajamas at 4 in the afternoon on that January day when Monty first dropped by to see him and to dare ask the question whose answer none of us exactly knew. How the hell did you manage to lose a leg? Since Alvin had been so uncompanionable when I got home from school, responding with a grunt of disgust to whatever I offered to cheer him up, I hardly expected our least lovable relative to elicit any response at all. But the intimidating presence of Uncle Monty, with the ever-present cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, was such that not even Alvin, in those early days, could tell him to shut up and go away. On that particular afternoon, Alvin couldn't begin to mimic the brash defiance that had enabled him to hop like a marvel across the Penn Station concourse upon arriving back home as an amputee. "France," Alvin hollowly replied to the big question. "Worst country in the world," Monty told him, and with no lack of certainty. As a 21-year-old in the summer of 1918, Monty had himself fought in France against the Germans in the Second Bloody Battle of the Marne, and then in the Argonne Forest when the Allies broke through on the Germans' western front, and so, of course, he knew everything about France. "I'm not asking you where," Monty said. "I'm asking you how." "How?" repeated Alvin. "Spit it out, kid. It'll do you good." He knew that, too. What would do Alvin good? "Where were you," he asked, "when you got hit? And don't tell me the wrong place. All your life you've been in the wrong place." "We were waiting for the boat to get us out." Here he closed his eyes as though hoping never to open them again. But instead of stopping right there, as I was praying for him to do, "Shot a German," he suddenly said. "And?" said Monty. "He was out there screaming for the rest of the night." So, go on. So he was screaming. So what?" "So, near dawn, before the boats due in, I crawled over to where he was, maybe 50 yards away. By then he was already dead. But I crawled around to the top of him, and I shot him twice in the head. Then I spit on the son of a bitch, and in that second, they threw the grenade. I got it in both legs. On one of my legs, the foot was twisted around, broken and twisted. That one they could fix. They operated and fixed it. They put a cast on it. They straightened it out, but the other one was gone. I looked down, and I saw one foot backwards and one leg dangling. The left leg just about amputated already. There it was, and nothing like the heroic reality that I had so shallowly imagined. "Out in no man's land all alone," Monty told him. "Could be you were hit by one of your own. It's not yet light, it's half-light, a guy hears gunfire, he panics, bingo, he yanks the pin." As for that surmise, Alvin had nothing to say. Anyone else might have understood and relented, if only because of the perspiration beading Alvin's forehead and the droplets pooled in the hollow of his throat and the fact that he still wouldn't open his eyes. But not my uncle. He understands and doesn't relent. "And how come you didn't get left there? After pulling that stunt, how come they didn't just leave you to die?" "There was mud everywhere," was Alvin's vacant reply. "The ground was mud. All I remember is that there was mud." "Who saved you, misfit?" "They took me. I must have been out of it, came and took me." "I'm trying to picture your brain, Alvin, and I can't. Spits. He spits. And that's the story of how he loses a leg." "Some things you don't know why you do them." It was I who was speaking. What did I know? But I was telling my uncle, "You just do them, Uncle Monty. You can't not." "You can't not, Philly, when you're a professional misfit." To Alvin, he said, "So now what? You're going to lay there living off disability checks? You're going to live like a Sharpie off your luck? Or would you maybe consider supporting yourself like the rest of us dumb mortals do? There's a job at the market for you when you're up out of bed. You start at the bottom, hosing down the floor and grating tomatoes. You start at the bottom with the buggy luggers and the schleppers, but there's a job there working for me and a paycheck every week. You pocket half the take at the Esso station, but I'll go with you anyway because you're still Jack's kid. And for my brother Jack, I'd do anything. I wouldn't be where I am without Jack. Jack taught me the produce business and then he died. Just like Steinheim wanted to teach you the building business. But no, nobody can teach you, misfit." Throws the keys in Steinheim's face. "Too big for Abe Steinheim. Only Hitler is big enough for Alvin Roth." In the kitchen, in a drawer with the potholders and the oven thermometer, my mother kept a long, stiff needle and heavy thread to truss up the Thanksgiving turkey after it was stuffed. It was the only instrument of torture, aside from the ringer, that I could think of that we owned, and I wanted to go in and get it and use it to shut my uncle's mouth. At the bedroom door, before leaving for the market, Monty turned back to summarize. Bullies love to summarize. The redundant, upbraiding summary. Nothing to equal it outside the old-fashioned flogging. Your buddies risked everything to save you, went in and dragged you out under fire, didn't they? And for what? So you could spend the rest of your life shooting craps with Margulis? So you could play 7-card stud up at the schoolyard? So you can go back and pump gas and steal Simkowitz blind? You make every mistake in the book. Everything you do wrong. Even shooting Germans you do wrong. Why is that? Why do you throw keys at people? Why do you spit? Someone who is already dead and you spit? Why? Because life wasn't handed to you on a silver platter like it was handed to the rest of the Roths. If it wasn't for Jack, Alvin, I wouldn't be standing here wasting my breath. There is nothing you have earned. Let's be clear about that. Nothing. For 22 years, you have remained a disaster. I'm doing this for your father, Sonny, not for you. I'm doing it for your grandmother. Help the boy, she tells me, so I'm helping you. Once you figure out how you want to make your fortune, come around on your peg leg and we'll talk. Alvin didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't holler. Even after Monty was out the back door and into his car, and he could have unleashed his every evil thought, he was too far gone to roar that day, or even to crack. Only I did, after he refused to open his eyes and look at me when I begged him to. Only I cracked. Alone, later in the one place in our house where I knew I could go to be apart from the living, and all that they cannot not do. Chapter 5. March 1942 to June 1942. Never before. Here's how Alvin came to have it in for Sandy. Before leaving him alone on the morning of his first Monday back, my mother had made Alvin promise to use his crutches to get around on until one of us was home to fetch for him. But Alvin so despised being on crutches that he refused, even by himself, to submit to the stability they provided. At night, when we were in our beds and the lights were out, Alvin would get me laughing by explaining why crutching wasn't so simple as my mother thought. You go to the bathroom, Alvin said, and they're always falling. They're always clattering. They're always making a fucking noise. You go to the bathroom, you've got these crutches, you try to get your cock, and you can't get your cock because your crutches are in the way. You gotta get rid of the crutches. Then, you're standing on one leg. That's not so good. You lean one way or another, you splatter all over the place. Your father tells me to sit down to piss. You know what I say? I'll sit when you do, Herman. Fucking crutches, standing on one leg, taking your dick out, Jesus. Pissing is hard enough to do as it is. I'm laughing uncontrollably now. Not only because the story is especially funny as he half whispers it in the darkened room, but because never before has a man revealed himself to me this way, using the prohibited word so freely and openly, cracking toilet jokes. Come on, Alvin says. Own up to it, kiddo. Pissing's not something that's as easy as it looks. So it happened that on that first Monday morning alone, when the amputation was still a limitless loss that he assumed would impede and torment him forever, he took the fall that no one in the family knew about other than me. He was standing braced against the kitchen sink, where, without the aid of his crutches, he'd gone for a glass of water. When he turned to start back to the bedroom, he forgot, for all possible reasons, that he had just the one leg and, instead of hopping, did what everyone else did in our house. Began to walk, and of course toppled over. The pain shooting up from the butt end of his stump was worse than the pain in the missing segment of his leg. Pain, Alvin explained to me, after I first watched him succumb to a siege in the bed beside me, that grabs you and won't let you go though no limb is left to cause it. There's pain where you are, Alvin said when the time had come to reassure me with some kind of comical remark, and there's pain where you ain't. I wonder who thought that up. The English hospital gave the amputees morphine to control the pain. You're always calling for it, Alvin told me, and whenever you do, they give it to you. You push a button for the nurse, and when she gets to you, you tell her, morphine, morphine, and you're pretty much out of it. How much did it hurt in the hospital, I asked him. It was no fun, kiddo. Was that the worst pain you ever had? Worst pain I ever had, he replied, was when my father closed the door of the car on my finger when I was 6 years old. He laughed, and so I laughed. My father said, when he saw me crying like hell, this little stinker about that high, my father said, "Stop crying. That doesn't do any good." Quietly laughing again, Alvin said, "And that was probably worse than the pain." My last memory of him, too. Later that day, he keeled over and died. Writhing on the kitchen linoleum, Alvin had no one to call for help, let alone for a shot of morphine. Everybody was off at either school or at work, and so, in time it was necessary to grope his way across the kitchen and the foyer to his bed. But just as he was positioning himself to push up from the floor, he spotted Sandy's art portfolio. Sandy still used the portfolio to preserve his large pencil and charcoal drawings between tracing paper, and to carry them with him when he had to take the drawings somewhere to show. It was too large to store in the sun parlor, and so he left it behind in our room. Mere curiosity impelled Alvin to fish the portfolio out a ways from beneath the bed, but because he was unable right off to determine its purpose, and because all he really wanted was to be back under the covers, he was ready to forget about it when he noticed the ribbon that held the two halves together. Existence was worthless, living was unendurable. He still throbbed with pain from the mindless accident at the kitchen sink, and so for no reason other than he felt himself powerless to carry off a physical task any more formidable, he fiddled with the ribbons until he undid the bow. What he found inside were the 3 portraits of Charles A. Lindbergh as an aviator that Sandy had told my parents he destroyed 2 years back, as well as those he'd drawn at the behest of Aunt Evelyn once Lindbergh became president. I'd only seen the new ones myself when Aunt Evelyn took me along to New Brunswick to hear Sandy give his Just Folks recruitment speech in the synagogue basement. This shows President Lindbergh signing into law the Universal Conscription Act, designed to keep America at peace by teaching our youth the skills necessary to protect and defend the nation. This one shows the president at a draftsman's drawing board, adding his aeronautical suggestions to the design for the nation's newest fighter bomber. Here, I show President Lindbergh relaxing at the White House with the family dog. Each of the new Lindbergh portraits, exhibited as a prelude to Sandy's New Brunswick talk, Alvin examined on the bedroom floor. Then, despite the destructive urge aroused by his registering the skill so meticulously expended on these beautiful likenesses, he placed them between the leaves of tracing paper and shoved the portfolio back under the bed. Once Alvin was out and around in the neighborhood, he hadn't to rely only on Sandy's Lindbergh drawings to realize that, while he'd been making raids on ammo depots in France, Roosevelt's Republican successor had come to be, if not entirely trusted by the Jews, accepted as tolerable for the time being, even among those of our neighbors who had started out hating him as passionately as my father did. Walter Winchell persisted in attacking the president on his Sunday night radio show, and everybody on the block devotedly tuned him in to give credence, while they listened, to his alarming interpretations of the president's policies. But as nothing that they had feared had come to pass since the inauguration, our neighbors slowly began putting more faith in Rabbi Bengelsdorf's optimistic assurances than in Winchell's dire prophecies. And not just the neighbors, but Jewish leaders all over the country began openly to acknowledge that Newark's Lionel Bengelsdorf, far from having betrayed them by endorsing Lindy in the 1940 election, had been prescient enough to see where the nation was headed, and that his elevation to the directorship of the Office of American Absorption and the administration's foremost advisor on Jewish affairs was the direct result of his having cleverly gained Lindbergh's confidence as an early supporter. If the president's anti-Semitism had somehow been neutralized, or more remarkably eradicated, Jews were willing to attribute the miracle to the influence of the venerable rabbi who was soon to become another miracle, an uncle by marriage to Sandy and me. One day, early in March, I wandered over, uninvited, to the dead-end street backing onto the school playground where Alvin had begun shooting craps and playing stud poker if the afternoon was warm enough and if it wasn't raining. He was rarely in the house anymore when I got home after school, and though generally he made it back by 5:30 for dinner, after dessert he'd head out to the hot dog hangout a block from my house to meet up with his old high school friends, a few of whom used to pump gas at the Esso station owned by Simkowitz, and had been fired along with him for stealing from the boss. I'd be asleep by the time he got in for the night, and only when he removed his leg and began hopping to and from the bathroom did I open my eyes and mumble his name before falling back to sleep. Some 7 weeks after he moved into the bed beside mine, I ceased to be indispensable, and abruptly found myself bereft of the mesmeric surrogate he'd been for Sandy, vanished now from my side into the stardom masterminded for him by Aunt Evelyn. The maimed and suffering American pariah, who had come to loom larger for me than any man I'd ever known, including my father, whose passionate struggles had become my own, whose future I fretted over when I should have been listening to the teacher in class, had begun to buddy up with the same good-for-nothings who helped turn him into a petty thief at 16. What he appeared to have lost in combat, along with his leg, was every decent habit inculcated in him when he was living as my parents' ward. Nor did he display any interest in the fight against fascism, which, 2 years earlier, no one could restrain him from joining. In fact, why he went scooting out of the house on his artificial leg every night was, at the beginning anyway, largely to avoid having to sit in the living room while my father read the war news aloud from the paper. There was no campaign against the Axis powers that my father didn't agonize about, particularly when things went badly for the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and it was clear how urgently they needed the U.S. arms embargoed by Lindbergh and the Republican Congress. By this time, my father could deploy the terminology of a war strategist quite proficiently when he expatiated on the need for the British, Australians, and Dutch to prevent the Japanese, who, in sweeping across Southeast Asia, exhibited all the righteous cruelty of the racially superior, from proceeding westward into India and southward into New Zealand and on to Australia. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific War news that he read to us was uniformly bad. There was the successful Japanese drive into Burma, the Japanese capture of Malaya, the Japanese bombing of New Guinea, and, after devastating attacks from the sea and air and the capturing of tens of thousands of British and Dutch troops on the ground, the fall of Singapore, Borneo, Sumatra, and Java. But it was the progress of the Russian campaign that upset my father most. The year before, when the Germans appeared to be on the verge of overrunning every major city in the eastern half of the Soviet Union, including Kiev, from whose environs my maternal grandparents had emigrated to America in the 1890s, the names of even lesser Russian cities like Petrozavodsk, Novgorod, Dnipropetrovsk, and Taganrog had become as familiar to me as the capitals of the 48 states. In the winter of 1941-42, the Russians had staged the impossible counterattacks that broke the sieges of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. But by March, the Germans had regrouped from their winter catastrophe and, as demonstrated by the troop movements mapped out in the Newark News, were reinforcing for a spring offensive to conquer the Caucasus. My father explained that what made the prospect of a Russian collapse so awful was that it would represent to the world the invincibility of the German war machine. The vast natural resources of the Soviet Union would fall into German hands and the Russian people forced to serve the Third Reich. Worst of all for us was that with Germany's eastward advance, millions and millions of Russian Jews would come under the control of an occupying army equipped in every way to implement Hitler's messianic program to deliver humanity from the clutches of the Jews. According to my father, the brutal triumph of anti-democratic militarism was imminent just about everywhere. The massacre of Russian Jewry, including members of my mother's extended family, was all but at hand, and Alvin didn't care one bit. No longer was he burdened by concern for anyone's suffering other than his own. I found Alvin down on the good knee of the rear leg, dice in hand, and the pile of bills beside him secured by a jagged chunk of cement. With the prosthetic leg jutting straight out in front of him, he looked like a squatting Russian dancing one of those crazy Slavic jigs. There were 6 other gamblers tightly encircling him, 3 still in the game, clutching what was left of their dough, 2 who were broke and just standing around, whom I vaguely recognized as ex-Weequake washouts now in their 20s, and the long-legged guy hovering over him, Alvin's partner, as it turned out, Shushi Margulis, a skinny zoot-suiter with a sinewy build and a gliding gait, the hanger-on from Alvin's gas station days whom my father most despised. Shushi was known to us kids as the Pinball King because a racketeer uncle whom he boasted about was the Pinball King, and the king as well of illegal slots down in Philadelphia where he reigned, and also because of the hours he spent racking up scores by banging away at the pinball machines in the neighborhood candy stores, shoving the machine, cursing it, violently shaking it from side to side until play was terminated either by the colored lights flashing tilt or by the store owner chasing him out. Shushi was the famous comedian who entertained his admirers by gleefully tossing lit matches into the mouth of the big green mailbox across from the high school, and who had once eaten a live praying mantis on a bet, and who, during his short-lived academic career, liked to hand the crowd a laugh outside the hot dog hangout by limping across Chancellor Avenue with one hand raised to stop the oncoming traffic, limping badly, tragically, though nothing was wrong with him. By this time, he was already into his 30s, and still living with his seamstress mother in one of the little flats at the top of a 2.5-family house next door to the synagogue on Wainwright Street. It was to Shushi's mother, known sympathetically to one and all as poor Mrs. Margulis, that my mother had taken Alvin's pants to have the zippers sewn in. Poor Mrs. Margulis, not merely because she survived as a widow by doing piecework at slave wages for a down-neck dress manufacturer, but because her Sharpie son seemed never to have held a job, other than as a runner for the bookie who worked out of the pool room around the corner from their house and just down the street from the Catholic orphanage on Lyons Avenue. The orphanage stood within the fenced-off grounds of St. Peter's, the parish church that oddly monopolized some 3 square blocks at the very heart of our unredeemable neighborhood. The church itself was topped by a tall bell tower and an even taller steeple that was capped by a cross that rose divinely above the telephone wires. Locally, There was no building that high to be seen until you proceeded nearly a mile down the Lyons Avenue hill to my birthplace, the Beth Israel Hospital, where every boy I knew had been born as well, and, at the age of 8 days, ritually circumcised in the hospital sanctuary. Flanking the bell tower of the church were 2 smaller steeples that I never cared to examine because the faces of Christian saints were said to be carved into the stone, and the church's high, narrow stained-glass windows told a story that I didn't want to know. Near the church was a small rectory. Like most everything else situated within the black iron palings of this alien world, it had been built during the latter part of the previous century, several decades before the first of our houses went up, and the western edge of the Weequahic neighborhood took shape as Newark's Jewish frontier. Behind the church was the grammar school serving the orphans. There were about 100 of them, and a smaller number of local Catholic kids. The school and the orphanage were run by an order of nuns. German nuns, I remember being told. Jewish children, raised even in tolerant households like mine, would generally cross the street on the rare occasions we saw them swishing our way in their witchy attire, and family lore had it that when my brother, as a small child sitting alone on our front stoop one afternoon, spotted a pair of them approaching from Chancellor Avenue, he had called excitedly to my mother, "Look, Ma! The nuts!" A convent stood next to the orphans' residence. Both were simple red brick buildings, and at the end of a summer's day, you'd sometimes catch a glimpse of the orphans. White children, girls and boys, aged from about 6 to 14, sitting outdoors on the fire escape. I have no memory of seeing the orphans in a group anywhere else, certainly not running freely about the streets the way we did. A swarm of them would have discomfited me no less than did the unsettling appearance of the nuns, primarily because they were orphaned, but also because they were said to be both neglected and indigent. Back of the residence hall, and unlike anything to be seen in our neighborhood, or anywhere else in an industrial city of close to 500,000, was a truck farm of the kind that made New Jersey the Garden State, back when compact family vegetable farms able to turn a small profit dotted the undeveloped rural reaches of the state. The food grown and harvested at St. Peter's went to feed the orphans, the dozen or so nuns, the old Monsignor in charge, and the younger priest who was his assistant. With the help of the orphans, the land was worked by a resident German farmer called Timmis, unless I'm remembering incorrectly, and that was the name of St. Peter's Monsignor, who had been running the place for years. At our public elementary school less than a mile away, it was rumored that the nuns, who instructed the orphans in class, routinely smacked the stupidest of them across the hands with wooden rulers, and that when a boy's offense was so gross as to be intolerable, the Monsignor's assistant was called in to beat him across the buttocks with the same whip the farmer used on the sway-backed pair of lumbering workhorses that pulled the plow for the spring planting. These horses we all knew and recognized because from time to time they'd wander together across the farm to the little wooded meadow at the southern boundary of St. Peter's domain and stick their heads inquisitively out above the gate that backed onto Goldsmith Avenue, where the crap game I'd come upon was taking place. There was a chain-link fence about 7 feet high at the edge of the playground on the near side of Goldsmith Avenue, and a wire fence set in posts at the edge of the truck farm on the far side. And since no houses had as yet gone up anywhere nearby, and there was never much foot or automobile traffic to speak of, an almost sylvan seclusion was conveniently provided there for the neighborhood's tiny handful of losers to pursue their pleasures out of harm's way. The closest I'd ever come to one of these sinister conclaves before was when, during some playground game, I'd had to chase a ball that had rolled to where they all huddled together just beyond the fence, uttering imprecations at one another and saving their sweet talk for the dice. Now, I was no righteous little foe of crap shooting, and I had begged Alvin to teach me how to play one afternoon when he was still on crutches, and my mother had instructed me to accompany him to his dentist appointment and do things like drop his fare into the fare box and hold his crutches for him while he helped onto the street from the bus's back door. That night, when everyone else had gone to sleep and we'd switched off the table lamp on the stand between our beds, he watched with a smile as, by the beam of my flashlight, I whispered, "Dice, be nice," and soundlessly rolled 3 consecutive 7s across my sheets. Yet as I watched him now in the clutches of his inferiors, and remembered all that my family had sacrificed to prevent him from turning himself into a replica of Shushie, every obscenity I'd learned as his roommate flooded foully into my mind. I cursed him in behalf of my father, my mother, and especially my ostracized brother. Was it for this that all of us had agreed to endure Alvin's objectionable behavior toward Sandy? Was it for this that he'd run off to fight in the war? I thought, take your fucking metal, Gimp, and shove it. If only he would learn his lesson by losing every last penny of his disability pension. But in fact, he couldn't stop himself from winning, any more than he could stop himself from abandoning the desire to ever again be anyone's hero. And having already raked in a big wad of bills, he held the dice to my lips, and in a gravelly voice with which he intended to be funny for his friends, he instructed me. Blowing them, baby. I blew, he rolled, and won yet again. 6 and 1, making what? He asked. 7, I obediently answered, the hard way. Shushie reached down to muss my hair and began calling me Alvin's mascot, as though mascot could encompass what I'd resolved to be for Alvin since he'd come home, as though a word so hollow and childish could account for why Alvin's King George medal was pinned to my undershirt. Shushie was dressed in a chocolate-colored, double-breasted gabardine suit with pegged trousers and wide padded shoulders and flamboyant lapels, his favorite get-up whenever he went bopping around the neighborhood, snapping his fingers and, in my mother's words, wasting his life, while back in their tiny attic flat, his mother hemmed 100 dresses a day to meet the family's bills. When he missed his point, Alvin drew all his winnings together and ostentatiously stuffed the bundle into his pocket, the man who broke the bank behind the high school. Then, by grasping the chain-link fence, he pulled himself to his feet. I knew, and not just from observing the tortured way he began limping about to get himself going, that a big boil had erupted on his stump the night before, and that he wasn't in the best of shape that day. But he refused any longer to be seen on crutches by anyone outside the family, and before going off to team up with sleazy Shushie and spend another day blatantly repudiating all the ideals that had made him a cripple, he harnessed the stump into the prosthesis, however much it hurt. "Goddamn leg maker," was all he said by way of complaint, as he came up to put his hand on my shoulder. "Can I go home now?" I whispered. "Sure, why not?" And then he took 2 $10 bills out of his pocket, nearly half my father's weekly paycheck, and flattened them against the palm of my hand. Never before had money seemed like something alive.
This ends Disc 5.